The air in the workplace was sterile, with a faint aroma of expensive coffee and the lingering whiff of floral perfume, which seemed to accompany Daphne wherever she went. The envelope rested on the polished mahogany desk, a plain, cream-colored piece of stationery with the ability to ruin everything Will and Electra had diligently crafted. It was a letter not intended for her eyes, a confession of crime, and a desperate request for forgiveness that, if seen by Electra, would shatter the pillars of her faith. Daphne peered at the seal, her thumb tracing the embossed edge, her mind torn between morality and pleasure. She had used this letter as a weapon, a piece of leverage to clear her own path, a method to remove the barriers that stood between her and the life she believed she deserved. However, as the seconds passed, the stillness in the room began to feel like a judgment, an indictment of the person she had become. The relationships in this circle had a tangled past that included ambition, treachery, and true, fragile affection. She thought about Will, how his eyes shone with a certain light when he spoke about Electra, a light that did not exist when he looked at anybody else. She remembered Electra, a woman whose fragility was hidden behind a powerful, protective shell and who had worked hard to find someone who could see past her walls. To distribute this letter would be the ultimate act of sabotage, destroying Will's reputation while also permanently scarring Electra. It was the type of maneuver that defined the competitive society they all lived in, where information was the most precious asset and destroying a competitor's happiness was frequently collateral damage in the pursuit of one's own mission. Daphne stood up, the chair scraping noisily against the floor, a sound that sounded too loud given her newfound resolve. She paced the length of the office, the metropolitan skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the lights below flickering like a circuit board of interconnected, chaotic life. She realized she had been hanging onto this letter for much too long, not only in her hands, but also in her mind. It had become a burden, a toxic influence that was affecting her sense of purpose. She wanted to be known for more than just the devastation she left behind, for having the courage to walk away from a victory that demanded the complete destruction of another person's tranquility. She took up the envelope, and the paper felt unusually weighty, as if the words inside had real mass. She needed to return it, not because she had a sudden moral epiphany, but because she realized the long-term expense of maintaining it was prohibitively expensive. The darkness that this secret would put over her own future was not something she was willing to accept. It would be a permanent anchor, a piece of luggage that would define every subsequent interaction, a secret that would need further lies, manipulations, and a continuing decline into a version of herself she disliked. Returning the letter was an act of self-preservation, a method to remove the toxicity that had begun to permeate her existence. The trek to Will and Electra's house felt like an odyssey, with each step a struggle with her own ego. The city appeared different tonight, less like a playground for the ambitious and more like a series of frail, interwoven traps. She walked past the areas where they had all shared drinks, argued, and made agreements, and each one seemed to carry a ghost of the person she had been or tried to be. She was acutely aware of the irony of her mission. She was an intruder who had become the protector of another person's sanctuary. She had spent months attempting to ruin this connection, and now she was essentially securing its continuation. When she reached their door, she hesitated, clutching the envelope in her palm, the frigid air stinging at her cheeks. She considered what she would say, how she would explain the appearance of the letter, without disclosing the extent of her personal involvement. She recognized that the explanation wasn't as important as the action. The letter was being returned, and that was the only reality that mattered. She knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet entrance, and she felt a quick, sharp twinge of sadness, not for the letter, but for the version of herself who felt entitled to keep it. She was giving away a piece of the game, leaving herself vulnerable and empty-handed, but for the first time in a long time, the emptiness seemed more like space than a void. Will answered the door, his face changing from astonishment to a complex blend of mistrust and exhaustion. He recognized her immediately and understood why she was there. He didn't say anything, but his gaze followed the movement of her hand as she held out the letter. Grand statements or dramatic apologies were unnecessary at the time. The action was sufficient. It was a silent recognition of the line that had been crossed and was now being repainted. She placed the letter in his palm, his fingers brushing against hers, and she felt weird and disconnected, as if she were watching a scene from a movie she had previously seen. She turned and walked away before he could ask any questions, before the tension became permanent. As she moved away, the weight on her chest began to lessen, leaving behind a peaceful, steady rhythm. She did not glance back. She knew that behind that door, the story of their lives would continue, with the same problems and opportunity for drama, but she would no longer be a part of it. She had removed herself from the equation, radically altering their destinies. The streets were calmer now, and the city's neon lights had blurred into soft, vague forms. She thought on her decisions, both premeditated and impulsive, that had led her to this point. She recognized that in a society where everyone was attempting to write their own story, sometimes the most significant act of agency was determining when to stop playing the game. By returning the letter, she restored her feeling of autonomy, which had been destroyed by her own thirst for power. She wasn't simply preserving their connection. She was also protecting herself from the repercussions of her own ambition. She found a bench in a small, peaceful park, the trees overhead producing long, lanky shadows that swayed in the breeze. She reflected on Will and Electra, wondering what they would do with the letter. Will they burn it? Would they utilize it as a point of reflection, a spark for open discussion? It no longer mattered. Her duty for the letter and the story it conveyed had ended. She was left with only the stark reality of her own existence, free of their drama, secrets, and future. It felt strange and liberating to be an outsider again, a spectator rather than a participant. She glanced up at the stars, which were veiled by the city's smog, and felt a profound sense of distance. She was no longer a game player, and for the first time, she felt free to breathe. Moving forward, she would make her own decisions, free of the elite's pressures, her peers' expectations, and the toxic cycle of secrets and lies that had been her life's defining characteristic. In that moment, she was a blank slate, having survived a brush with her own worst instincts and emerged unscathed. The city around her was a huge, chaotic creature that required regular contact, rewarding the brave and punishing the timid. She had been both at different times, and she was aware that the obstacles would resurface. But for tonight, the silence was plenty. She had committed an act that would most likely go unnoticed, a minor, subtle shift in the tectonic plates of their social universe that would never be fully understood or appreciated. But that was fine. The satisfaction came not from being recognized, but from performing the act itself, knowing that she had decided to be better than her surroundings. She wondered idly if Electra would ever know. It was a momentary idea, a relic of the person who cared about optics and narrative, but she brushed it aside. The truth was that the letter had vanished, the threat had been neutralized, and the conclusion was certain. Whatever chats or reconciliations they had would be their own, unaffected by her meddling. She was no longer a variable in the equation. She had a tremendous sense of tranquility as the night progressed and the city fell silent. The volatility had subsided, the storm had passed, and she was left in a peaceful, reflective aftermath. She recognized that the route she had chosen was neither easy nor guaranteed to bring her happiness. But it was a road she could take with some dignity, one characterized by her own decisions rather than the wreckage of others. The future was unwritten, and for the first time, it seemed like an opportunity rather than a danger. She stood up, wiped the dust from her coat, and set out on the long walk home, leaving the dramas, letters, and lives of those she had previously attempted to ruin far behind her in the city's dark, indifferent center. The absurdity of the scenario lingered with her. She had entered this nightmare expecting control and authority, only to escape with nothing but her own conscience. But in the end, that was the most valuable asset she possessed. She had learned that in a world where secrets were the currency, the most powerful thing she could do was be transparent, to be someone whose actions did not require a layer of justification or a veneer of innocence. She had been forced to confront her darkest elements, and while the reflection was unpleasant, it was also illuminating. She was moving on, not with a sense of victory, but with a clear awareness of who she was and what she was capable of. She strolled past the businesses and deserted streets, the city lights reflected in the puddles, creating a tapestry of light and shadow that seemed to represent her own journey. She knew there would be more tests, temptations, and instances in which she would have to choose between the easy and the right road. But she knew she was more prepared to deal with them now. She had demonstrated to herself that she could make alternative decisions, that she could prioritize something other than her own ambition. That understanding was the ultimate victory, a little, quiet, and profoundly personal victory that far outweighed any social or professional achievement she could have dreamed for. As she arrived at her apartment, she felt a final, lingering sensation of accomplishment. The letter had vanished, her role in the story was concluded, and the future was once more a blank sheet. She locked the door behind her, the sound creating a final, definitive barrier between her and the world she had just left. She took a deep breath, the air in her house nice and comforting, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself just be. The drama, treachery, and sophisticated dance of social maneuvering were all outside, protected by her own walls. She was safe, whole, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like herself. The city would continue to churn, the bold would pursue the beautiful, and the secrets would spread more, but she would no longer be a part of it. She had discovered her own route, a peaceful, steady, and completely independent road, and that was sufficient. The afternoon sun flooded through the design office's big windows, sending long golden shadows across the sketches and fabric samples scattered on the table. The tranquil hum of activity in the building seemed remote and unreal in comparison to Daphne's mental maelstrom. For days, she had kept a secret that weighed heavy on her conscience. It was a simple envelope, tiny enough to fit in a drawer but powerful enough to change the course of 3 lives. Daphne gently held the letter between her fingers, peering at the slightly crumpled paper as if it might answer the numerous questions that ran through her mind. She hadn't intended to retain it. When she first discovered it, she was practically compelled to read it, driven by curiosity and her fragile emotional state. But now that she knows what the letter contains and what it means for Electra and Will, she feels as if she has gone into a place she should not have been. Electra and Will had been battling recently. Everyone around them could see it, yet neither of them openly acknowledged how bad their troubles had gotten. Their chats were brief, and their grins forced. They appeared to be walking in parallel rather than side by side. Daphne had watched everything happen from a distance, feeling empathetic yet curiously conflicted. Daphne had moments where she wondered whether their relationship was coming to an end. In those moments, a tiny part of her wondered what it would mean if Will was genuinely free of the relationship. She had continually pushed the thought away, refusing to allow it turn into anything selfish. Nonetheless, emotions were rarely uncomplicated, and the distinction between empathy and desire had occasionally blurred. The letter altered everything. Electra had written it, though Daphne had no idea at first. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the phrases full of vulnerability and honesty. Electra had poured her heart out on the page, admitting anxieties she had never expressed aloud. She wrote about how much she loved Will, how scared she was of losing him, and how she was concerned that her own anxieties were driving him away. Daphne was astonished after reading those words. Electra was not giving up on their relationship. She was fighting for it with every ounce of her courage. The letter was not intended to end things, but rather to save them. It was a message of truth, one that Electra prayed Will would receive before the stillness between them became too great to bridge. However, the letter had never reached him. It had somehow gotten lost among documents in the office, forgotten until Daphne discovered it. Days had gone before she knew what it was. At first, she persuaded herself it could be too late, that the talk Electra desired had already occurred in another form. Nonetheless, Daphne understood the truth. Will had never read those words. She had seen the tension between them increase. She had seen Will become more distant, and Electra become more unsure. Every time they chatted, an unspoken question hung in the air. something fragile that neither of them seemed able to convey. And all the time, Daphne kept the letter secret in her hands. She held back at first because she was hesitant. She told herself she didn't know when to return it. She was concerned that sharing it might exacerbate the situation. But as time progressed, those reasons grew thinner. The true reason was more difficult to admit. She was scared that returning the letter might cause Electra and Will to reconcile. Admitting the truth to herself had been terrible. Daphne did not want to be the type of person who ruined someone else's happiness for the sake of her own. However, human emotions were complex, and the heart rarely followed clear moral lines. She had spent many nights considering the repercussions of each decision. Keeping the letter required quiet. Returning it indicated honesty. And honesty, even when unpleasant, was always the right choice. That revelation came over her gradually but strongly, like the quiet after a storm. The decision was made the minute she realized what kind of person she wanted to be. Whatever transpired between Electra and Will should be decided by them, not a piece of paper stashed in a drawer. Daphne set the envelope on the desk and sighed slowly. She reflected on Electra's hopeful comments and the courage it took to reveal such vulnerability. Nobody deserved to have their voice silenced before it was ever heard. The letter was never supposed to be kept secret. It was intended to heal the gap between two individuals who still loved one another. Later that evening, the opportunity arrived.